Dr. Foojan Zeine, and welcome to the Inner Voice Show, the show that's about you and all that matters in your life from a psychological perspective. In this show, I speak with our guests, our experts in the psychology of life, of sexuality, of intimacy, of relationships, and again, most of the things that are hopefully and mostly important to you. So today I'm really glad to have a great author and a great person who has created a wonderful organization with us, and she's Alexandra Katehakis. I'm going to tell you a little bit about her. She's a marriage and family therapist, and she's a founder and the clinical director of the Center of Healthy Sex in Los Angeles area, California. She's the senior fellow at the Meadows and faculty of the International Institute of Trauma and Addiction Professionals, and the 2012 Carnes Award recipient. She's a certified sex addiction therapist and a supervisor specializing in the treatment of sexual disorders. Mrs. Katehakis is author of Sex Addiction as Affect Dysregulation, a neurobiologically informed holistic treatment, which was published 2016. She's also the co-author of the AASECT Award and 2016 Clark Vincent Award winning A Mirror of Intimacy, Daily Reflections on Emotional and Erotic Intelligence, and that was published 2014. She's a contributing author to the 2013 Clark Vincent Award-winning Marketing Advances in Comprehensive Guide for Treating Female Sex and Love Addicts. And she's an author of Erotic Intelligence. And you can see the books as they're coming onto the screen. Igniting Hot, Healthy Sex After Recovery from Sex Addiction, which was out in 2010. I'm so glad to have you, Alexandra, with me. So welcome to our show.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
I know that you have founded the organization, the Center for Healthy Sex. So first tell me a little bit about your organization. I know that I've referred a lot of clients to that organization, and they're all very happy, and that's why I wanted to talk to you and have you with us on the show. So tell me a little bit about the organization and what brought it for you that you wanted to actually open and found this organization in Los Angeles.
Well, in around 1998, I started working with people who reported that they were sexually addicted or compulsive. And at that time, there was a lot of work being done to help people stop the sexually destructive behavior. But there was no real plan for how to help people be sexual or restore their healthy sex in that particular model. So that's when I started thinking about, well, if people are sexually addicted and they're engaging in all these sexual behaviors that are actually destroying their lives, hurting themselves, hurting other people, and we help them stop doing that, where does their healthy sexuality come into play? So I started to see the problem on a continuum from problematic sexual behavior to healthy sexual behavior.
And that's how I came to write the book Erotic Intelligence, because I wanted to create some sort of guideline for people to help them restore their sexuality to something intimate, good, erotic, even spiritual, depending on what they wanted. And at that time, I started to think about a center for healthy sexuality that would help people with a broad base of sexual issues, whether they were issues of sexual desire, differences in libido between couples, dysfunction issues, pelvic pain issues, or issues of sexual addiction and compulsivity. So my idea was this continuum of sexuality, and the model I've created is a holistic model for incorporating all parts of sex and sexuality, looking at what is problematic for people, where they feel shame around sex, and helping people to have the kind of sex life and the kind of sexuality they prefer.
You use the word healthy versus unhealthy or versus addiction. Tell me a little bit about what you mean by healthy sexuality. Like, how would someone assess if their sexuality in a healthy module?
Right, that's
question, because there's a lot of argument about healthy. I mean, what's healthy for me may not be for you or somebody else. So I'm not talking about what's normal, because there's no such thing as normal anymore, because that implies some sort of rigid standard for sex and sexuality. But I think healthy sex should restore a person to a sense of their own dignity. They should feel alive as a result of it, lively, vital, sexy, good about themselves. And we all know what that feeling is when we feel particularly sexy. It's the vitality in the body. And so I think those are the questions we all have to ask ourselves, is what makes me feel good sexually? How do I get excited about sex and sexuality? And after sex, do I feel better about myself, not dirty or worse about myself or shame about myself? Sometimes that shame can be because the person thinks what they're doing is not okay. So it's not the act itself, it's just their ideas about the act. And those are some of the things we talk about at Center for Healthy Sex also. So we want to help people get rid of shame around their sex and sexuality. And that doesn't mean that people should be shameless, that anything goes sexually, including, rape or having non-consensual sex. It's not that at all. It's about feeling congruent with what you desire and not being ashamed about what turns you on, but being honest about it, being able to talk about it.
Looking at sexuality in the terms of desire, erotics, because one of your books that you've written is about eroticism, versus the conversation of the emotions. Like, I know that healthy people are in a relationship. I mean, there are a lot of healthy people who are not in a relationship and they choose to have sexuality and sex, act with different people as pleasure, as enjoying that. But there's also the conversation of being in long-term relationships where maybe the desire changes. And I know that there's a lot of body of research at this point that's going out where we've already, even when couples are in a very, very good bonding relationships, that the concept of desire in long-term, not long distance, but long-term relationships kind of shifts from the beginning to the middle of the relationship. And what is your experience as you work with the healthy couples in the area of eroticism and desire?
Well, this is, the big question for humanity. We are animals first and foremost, and sex and sexuality initially was for purposes of procreation. But we're long past that now. We're staying in these long marriages, and we're living longer than ever before. So the marriages are not only, old at 20 years old, they're 40, 50 years old sometimes. And so how do you change your sexuality over the lifespan is really the question. Because initially when we meet somebody, there's a lot of novelty. And that novelty is there in a highly dopamine-driven way, which forges and forces us into close-in relationships. It's sort of the glue that brings people together. And then over time, as we become more connected, more familial, different neurochemicals come into play that have us feeling close and safe and engenders trust. And that can be antithetical to that heat of eroticism. So I think one of the things that people have to do, or there's several things people have to do. One is that we all have to be current about who we are and know ourselves and be honest about what our sexual interests are over time. So what was once a non-issue perhaps in your 20s because your genitals were always at the ready, you were always turned on, it didn't matter by whom. After you have children, that can sort of die down, especially for women. But when you wake up at the end of your 30s or 40s or 50s, and you're still having the same sex you had at 20, you're not really redefining yourself as an adult sexual being. And so couples will talk about all sorts of things, like their values around raising kids or money, or their goals in life, but they rarely talk about how their sex life needs to shift and change. So that requires a lot of ability to manage your own anxiety in relation to your partner, and to be able to sit down with your partner eyeball to eyeball and say, you know, I've had these sexual fantasies for a while that I'd like to tell you about or share with you. And you have to be, the person on the receiving end of that has to be able to be open-minded and non-judgmental and actually curious and interested about why that's so arousing to their partner. And then also notice what scares you about that, or freaks you out about it, or makes you think that it's gross or dirty, and really challenge your assumptions about it, because it's just a fantasy. And so together, if both parties are open and non-judgmental and willing to listen and get curious, that starts to create a novelty between the two, again, another kind of heat at the possibility of exploring these things together. And oftentimes they're just explored in fantasy, or sometimes in role play, which injects novelty into the system. It also forces us to have a more grown-up or adult sexuality. You know, many people still have sex at 50 the way they did at, 25, where they sort of get into bed and they're kind of looking at each other with the lights off, and then they have intercourse, and then that's the end of it. So there's no real contact with their partner, no real eye contact, no talking to each other, no looking at each other's body and experiencing pleasure together and watching your partner have pleasure. So this requires that we, be sexual adults, essentially.
Is the stop for people to talk about their sexuality? Because I do know that as therapists, we consistently ask people to go ahead and talk about their sexuality. My experience the past 25 years in sessions sitting with couples has been that they'll talk about anything, but the minute that there's a conversation about their sexuality, first of all, they shy away. Second, they're being generous in not wanting to say anything negative about their spouse or partner because they don't want them to be upset. And if there's anything that is stated that is a little bit negative about either one of them, they take it to heart so bad. It really hurts them to the core. They could say anything about each other's behavior, about their family, their mother, their whomever, and be the nastiest person in the session, and they could take it. And then suddenly, very soft thing about, I don't like the way you touch me this way, or this way that we're doing it is boring, or I'm no longer interested in such and such, or your weight gain has created where I don't have a desire when I look at you visually. It becomes such a personal, heartfelt hurt. Right. And in your experience, where does that come from as you have worked with the couples in sexuality?
Well, I think that comes from a lack of security in oneself. And if over time we become completely reliant upon our partner to validate us as sexual beings, we're in trouble. Because sometimes if you get into bed and you want to have sex and your partner doesn't, and you make that all about yourself, you're creating a very bad situation. Instead of thinking, oh, maybe my partner's tired, or maybe she is, having menstrual cramps, or maybe he or she just had a bad day. It has nothing to do with me and whether I'm sexy enough or interested enough or smart enough. And that's where people collapse down. They're so busy looking at their partners for validation, they don't validate themselves sexually. So when you look in the mirror and you think that your body looks beautiful, sexy, that you're taking care of yourself, that you feel vital and alive, and your partner doesn't see that, that is not your problem. That's their problem, number one. And so collapsing under the weight of your partner's opinion about you is really a foreclosure on your own self. And I think sex and sexuality is really at the core of our being. So we're unzipping, we're getting naked, we're really letting somebody see us, and we're very, very afraid that we're going to be judged or, worse yet, humiliated or embarrassed because we like something the other person doesn't like. And usually the person who's doing the judging is the one who is defensive or afraid of the sex act, and they won't own that. So if, for example, you and I were in a relationship and I said to you, gee, I wanted to try having sex with a giraffe, and you said, oh my God, that's disgusting, you're a pervert. It's because the idea of having sex with a giraffe is so unusual for you that you don't want to look at your own sexual limitations. Instead, a healthier response would be like, wow, that seems a little odd to me, Alex, but tell me what's arousing to you about giraffes. What do you like about that? When did you first have that interest? How do you imagine you and I would do that together? What would that say about me? That makes me really nervous, having a sex with a giraffe. So, you see, it's a difference between a conversation that is judgmental and closes and collapses versus one that's open and curious, where there's possibility. And the truth is, we may never have sex with a giraffe, but the act of talking about it might be very arousing to the two of us, and that creates novelty and eroticism, again, in the system.
Could it also be that some people would get very, very scared because not necessarily when it could be something a little bit more out there to have a sex with a giraffe, but however, like my fantasy is that I see the girl or the boy, you know, 2 doors down, or I see so and so in the office every day, and I start having that fantasy about him or her, and the partner who's listening to this is too close for comfort. This isn't the giraffe. This is just too close for comfort. And the allowance of the conversation for them also creates an allowance for the person who's having the fantasy to continuously go on with the fantasy. And then at one point, the fear of the person in a relationship is that they will act on that fantasy, which will no longer be a fantasy, will be a reality, and to them would be the end of the relationship. If they're feeling they want to be monogamous and not, you know, enter anybody else in there. What happens in those areas where you're exploring your fantasies and and you're not keeping it private? It's not like, okay, this is a private thing where I'm not allowing a fantasy to get into action. However, I'm opening it up, and now my partner feels very, very scared and insecure because it's just too close, and also by this way of receptiveness of an acceptance from the partner, I also get this carte blanche that, hey, maybe I can just continue with my fantasy, and the fantasy suddenly, one day when I'm in the office, turns into an action of flirtatiousness and moves forward.
Right. Well, this is a complicated scenario that you're talking about.
I know.
It's rare that somebody will actually be that honest and say, hey, I'm having a fantasy about somebody in my office and I want to tell you about it. Usually people want to tell about it because they don't want to act on it. When fantasies are kept secret like that, that's when we're most in danger of acting things out, because these kind of secrets flourish in that way. So usually if someone's saying that, then it may be painful to be on the receiving end of hearing that, but that could also open up a very rich conversation about what does that person represent, that fantasy person. Well, you know what, if I were to have sex with them, it's unencumbered. You know, we don't have kids together or in-laws together, and I just feel like I would feel so free and so desired, and I don't feel that from you. I feel criticized from you, or I feel like you don't want to have sex with me that often. That cracks open a very big conversation for the couple that can be incredibly healing and arousing. Mm-hmm. If, on the other hand, the person having the fantasy in the workplace tells their partner, and then they act on it, then that tells you something about the state of the marriage and the integrity between those two people. Unless those people agree, well, gee, maybe we want to be in an open relationship. So again, now we're in an honest conversation. So honesty is incredibly, and can be incredibly painful, but it also can be the portal to having more erotic experiences because the truth is coming to the surface.
So what I'm hearing from you is that when a fantasy is brought out and it appears to be much more safe in the context of the relationship when there is an acceptance and an open arm in dialoguing about a fantasy as a fantasy. And when the fear comes that the fantasy might become a reality, it should also, we can create a reassurance in the relationship, in bringing the relationship in more of a secure place, so that it can also open up the conversations about the fantasy as a novelty intentionality and honesty intentionality, and bringing you into my world. And when it's done in that intention and the acceptance is there, then it brings people closer together and it creates a form of play. As long as they feel like this is play, then they can have fun with it. But the minute they think, oh my God, this is a threat, then they will go into their insecurity, which then we can work with it, or the couple can work with it to create some reassurance. Is there any type of a fantasy that you would say, no, we're not going to talk about that. That's not going to go well if it's, if it kind of breaks a bond.
Well, first of all, I want to say that's a beautiful distinction that you made between play versus threat. Because play is a very important part of sex, and threat is a threat and danger to the attachment between two people. And if the person who's fantasizing about the person in the workplace has crossed a line of flirtation and the partner feels threatened, that person needs to make adjustments in the workplace and say, you know what, I'm moving departments, or I'm going to let that person go if they work for me, or I'm going to do something to make sure that you feel safe and that I get that person out of my orbit, because my relationship with you is more important than this fantasy person. So that would be a way to secure the relationship. This question about which fantasies would be taboo and which are not, I think it's difficult to say. It really depends on the couple and what their values and what their mores and morals are about what's okay to fantasize about and what isn't. And again, I think it has to do with threat and threat to the secure functioning of the couple. So let's say that, I and my partner fantasize about other people, but one day he starts talking about my sister or my best friend. At that point, I might feel like, you know what, this isn't funny, this doesn't feel like play to me, this actually starts to feel threatening. Let's talk about what's really going on for you right now, that you want to evoke my sister or best friend. Because that doesn't turn me on, it's not exciting. In fact, it makes me feel like I can't trust you. So I think conversations, difficult conversations, are essential if people are going to wade into these waters.
And since you've spoken about a fantasy as kind of a mode of creation of novelty, what other means of novelty would you suggest to couples when they are in a relationship after a little while? So I know that having sexuality in different locations, or going on trips, or dressing in a different way, or role playing in a different way could also be a way of creating novelty. What else do you suggest to the couples in that form of creation of novelty?
I think the most powerful creation of novelty is eye contact. Really looking at your partner and what are you seeing? And taking time even, to sit opposite one another, knee to knee, and just to quietly gaze into one another's eyes for 3, 4, 5 minutes and see, what are you really seeing? Are you looking deeply into the soul of that person that, you love more than anyone in the world, who you've had children with perhaps, who you've been through difficult times with, who you remember when you were younger? Seeing the beauty and the essence of who that person is can be unbelievably novel and arousing, because you will remember why you fell in love, and all of the constructs, the day-to-day business of being in relationship together, the aggravations, the bickering, falls away in those moments of deep eye contact. Because the eyes are incredibly novel to the autonomic nervous system. Also, watching your partner in different contexts, when you see them doing the thing that they're really best at, that can be incredibly arousing and a turn on, to say, wow, he's really competent, or oh, she's so smart when she's in her milieu, or he's really, women I know are very turned on when their husbands are active with their children. Or you notice your partner's great smile or something along those lines, and you actually tell them in the moment. You're not stingy with your compliments. You really see all of their humanity. And I think part of what happens is that over time we stop seeing our partners as sexual beings. We see them as householders and workers and parents and, children, and we don't see them, the sexual animalistic part of them. So I would encourage people to look for those things, which are very low-tech things. They're things you can do day in and day out.
The other question that comes up for me is, do you think that learning different skills in sexuality also helps? Because I've noticed also with a lot of clients, I also work internationally with different population, and I've noticed on many of the, let's say, patriarchal system societies, where the men have been the receivers many times of the pleasure, for example, or many times the skills never needed to be built. It was more of, very, very simple skills of sexuality would do. And it was just, sexuality was, especially between couples, it was still for the procreation, and sometimes all the other aspects of the efforts that needed to come to learn the skill, practice skills together, never showed up. And how much do you see building skills in sexuality also adds to the novelty or adds to the healthy sexuality?
Well, I think tremendously, and that's a great question. In this culture, so much of our sex education comes from pornography. So it's actually the opposite problem, but it still creates similar problems. This idea of eye contact, slowing down, touch. I mean, the skin is the biggest organ in the body. So really lingering with your lover's body and finding out where they like to be touched, what kind of pressure, which parts of their body are most arousing, requires a deep intimacy between two people. And if the culture creates shame around sexuality, like, it's dirty, you shouldn't do it, or you should just do it when you're married, you should do the dirty thing when you're married, there's a fear that people have of really opening themselves up to being curious about each other's bodies, and that pleasure should be one of the main points of sexuality, even if it's for procreation. Conceiving a baby should be a pleasurable activity. Why not? So this matter of slowing down, investigating bodies, asking about what's arousing, what isn't, about pressure, rhythm, speed, all of that creates a language of erotic intelligence, which is what you're talking about, as opposed to not having a handbook whatsoever. It's sort of like trying to cook a meal for the first time and never having had instructions about how to cook. You just throw a bunch of things in the pot and hope it turns out okay. And usually it doesn't. It boils or burns or scorches or something like that. So this is, I think, the first sort of battle that we have in the field of sex and sexuality, is educating people from very young about what it means to have a body, what it means to have pleasure, whose body it is when you get to say yes, no, and what it means to explore without shame with another person.
And when we have about 5 more minutes, and I wanted to ask you about your books, and I wanted to tell the audience a little bit about your books and where they can find it, and your latest book. And can they just go to the website centerforhealthysex.com?
Yeah, the books, the descriptions of the books are on centerforhealthysex.com. Amazon also has the books there for sale, so that's where you can purchase them. Each one is a little bit different. Erotic Intelligence was written for people that are in recovery from sex addiction, and it's a simple guide for moving from healthy sex to intimate sex, to erotic sex, to spiritual sex. But people have told me that even if they're not in recovery from sex addiction, they found it a very useful guide for people people.
Absolutely, because I know that I've offered it to some clients who they necessarily did not have sexual addiction, but the way that they had learned about sexuality in their teenage years was just to have sex, and you had the split. You had sex with girls, and then you went and found your wife. And the way you have sex with wife is different than when you have sex with other girls. So to bring that into the transition of just sex versus intimate sex, your book really, really helps.
Good, and I think that is the difference between the old country and the new country. I mean, I'm Greek American, and so I know what the old country ideas are like, being first generation American myself. And sometimes making that transition from the family of origin, where you're speaking one language at home and you're speaking English and you're in an American culture in the world, can be very, very challenging to loosen up those ideas. But we're in the 21st century, and women are, much more liberated today than we've ever been, and more women feel entitled to sexual pleasure as well, which makes it more fun for the man anyway. So being able to put together lover, wife, I think is really important for long-term healthy marriages. I want to say my book, Mirror of Intimacy, is a beautiful book for daily reflections on sex and sexuality, and that one was written specifically for that reason, so you don't have to read it all the way through. Every day, as you know, there's a different topic on sex and sexuality, and then we offer some healthy sex tips at the end of every reading that help you engage with your partner every day, whether it's a conversation or a foot massage or something along those lines. And that book, as you said, is an award-winning book, and people really enjoy that book. And you can also get those daily meditations 4 times a week if you go to our website, which is centerforhealthysex.com. And on the right-hand column, there's a button where you can enter your email address, and you'll automatically get those daily reflections if you don't want to buy it.
Yeah, I do get them, and they're awesome. they're great. So when what is your next project? I know you're very busy and you keep going to the next and to the next. And what's your next project that we should be looking for?
Well, I would say, finally, I do want to talk about my latest book that came out in September, as you mentioned, called Sex Addiction as Affect Dysregulation. And this book was written for therapists. So for those people that are therapists that are listening, that book conceptualizes the problem of sex addiction as a traumatic problem of affect dysregulation, and looks at all the neurobiological underpinnings to the problem, so that we have compassion for people that really struggle with destroying themselves by having sex. That book took a long time to write, so I'm actually resting right now.
Okay.
Not really resting, I'm finishing my dissertation in clinical sexology. So that's in the forefront of what I'm doing.
I would love to invite you for another show just to talk about sexual addiction. This show we kind of covered healthy sexuality among couples, and I would love to have you back to talk about sexual addiction, the traumas that are underneath it, the dynamic of sexual addiction, and all that comes from there. I'll wait for you to rest a bit, and then call upon you to join my show again, if you will.
Sure, anytime.
It was a pleasure to have you on the show, and thank you for all that you contributed to our couples and to the audience that are listening.
Okay, thank you, Foojan. Thank you for having me.
And for all of you who are with us, thank you again for being with us. And until next week, create a wonderful world for yourself. Bye-bye.